You're tuned to the wavelength of your own beauty. It's your host, Ahmed Younis, and this is The Study. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, beautiful human beings, you are indeed in The Study. I'm your host, Ahmed Younis, coming to you from the shores of the Pacific Ocean in the middle of what has become the uprisings for justice in America. And we continue with our series themed from the track Astronomy from the Black Star album, Mos Def, Talib Kweli, Yassin Bey. And we continue our journey in American history to try to understand how intertwined is racism with American history. What is the continuation of Harriet Tubman's story? And what is the role of religion in the promotion of racism? I don't know about you, but I feel like this podcast is banging. It's fire. IGTV, we're there. YouTube, we're there, coming to a podcast service near you, and we're doing it. It's a beautiful thing. Much love. Here we go. You're in The Study. Okay, so now I'm going to jump back to Stanley McChrystal's book, page 226. Cotton took over the economy of the Deep South just as the foreign slave trade was outlawed in 1808, and new slaveholding states like Florida, Louisiana, and Texas sought an influx of cheap labor. As a result, many slaves born in the early 1800s on Maryland's eastern shore, Tubman included, lived with the constant fear of being torn from their families and sold south. Going south meant not only permanent separation from family, but also the specter of a hellish world they imagined had to be far more cruel than the lives they had already lived. And you'll remember when, sorry, I'm done, unquote. And you'll remember when you watch 12 Years a Slave, like the story of Solomon Northope. This dude, people come up to him and they're like, yo, you want to come to Washington, D.C. and play violin at a show and get paid for it? He's like, yeah, I'll come to Washington, D.C., play violin. Duck, 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 he gets tricked. Eventually he ends up what? On a plantation as a slave. And what does he have to do? He has to find his way back. Now that way back, you know, Harriet Tubman, she went 450 miles in order to escape. And then she did the trip throughout the 1850s 13 times. 450 miles each way, 13 times. And when she wasn't doing that, she was traveling and raising money for the movement. She was getting people to open their homes. The first home in the Underground Railroad, before it was an Underground Railroad, was Harriet Tubman's mom and dad's house. And this democratic process of black and white and other Americans who are choosing to defy the system as it existed in order to help people escape from terrorism, in order to help people escape from the brutality of slavery. And then you know how it goes. Once life goes well, the fact pattern changes. Back on 231 of McChrystal's book, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which required Northern authorities to return escaped slaves to their owners, reaching the Pennsylvania state line didn't amount to safety. So now we're moving the goalpost. Now getting to Pennsylvania is not enough. Back to the book. Tubman needed the Underground Railroad to help her and her family get from Dorchester County, Maryland, all the way to the safety of Canada. It's called Ontario now, but you know what it used to be called then? St. Catharines. where there was a growing community of black refugees protected by British laws that had outlawed slavery decades earlier. For shame, America. For shame. Let me tell you something about St. Catherine's. You know, in Egypt, there's a monastery that definitely serves as an underground railroad of Christians, primarily Coptic, who are sought after by terrorist organizations, criminals. It's called Santa Catherine. St. Catherine's. It's an amazing place. I visited there when I lived in Egypt in middle school. Okay, well, if that journey wasn't enough for the hardcore, for the beloved, let's keep going. Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor of Rome, in Meditations, Book 5, number 19, he says, worldly circumstances and affairs cannot touch the mind, cannot penetrate it, cannot alter or move it, for the mind alters and moves itself, molding the world in the shape of whatever judgments it pleases the mind to make. Those are the words of an emperor. Its application, Harriet Tubman. Other members of the human race are my nearest relations in this respect only. I am obliged to do them good and to be patient with them, but if they prevent me from doing what I know is right, then they become as distant and indifferent to me as the sun and the wind, or a wild beast. Although others may at times hinder me from acting, they cannot control or impede my spirit and my will. Great words. Application, Harriet Tubman. Okay, now that we've laid the groundwork. Wait, what do you mean? That was the introduction? Yeah, that was the introduction. Okay, now that we've laid the groundwork, let's just take a couple steps back. Let's go to Ibram Kendi, easily one of the most brilliant scholars on race. Let's go to his New York Times bestseller, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. The book starts before America, actually. And one of the main concepts that I try to relay to those folks who are willing to read this book is that it appeals to me for the following argument among many others. And that is that for the most part in human history, racist ideas come as a justification post hoc, after. Racist action, system, culture exists and is used to benefit the dominant class. Again, from the top. Racist ideas are not the beginning of the story. Racist actions are always the beginning of the story. And then there is a rationalizing of those racist actions pursuant to racist ideas. And this is from, Aristotle. Aristotle believed that people who live in extreme climates are incapable of the level of the quality of reasoning of people who lived in moderate climates. Let me go to page 17 of Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. Quote, Aristotle, who lived 384 to 322 BCE, concocted a climate theory to justify Greek superiority, saying that extreme hot or cold climates produced intellectually, physically, and morally inferior people who were ugly and lacked the capacity for freedom and self-government. Aristotle labeled Africans burnt faces, the original meaning in Greek for, are you ready for this, my people? Are you ready for this, my people? Ethiopian. And viewed the ugly extremes of pale or dark skins as the effect of the extreme cold or hot climates. By the birth of Christ or the start of the Common Era, Romans were justifying their slaveholding practices using Aristotle's climate theory. And soon the new Christianity began to contribute to these arguments. The first generation of Puritans began rationalizing the enslavement of these Negroes without skipping a Christian beat. Their chilling nightmares of persecution were not the only hallucinations the Puritans had carried over the Atlantic waters in their minds to America. From the first ships that landed in Virginia in 1607 to the ships that survived the Great Hurricane of 1635 to the first slave ships some British settlers of colonial America carried across the sea Puritan, biblical, scientific, and Aristotelian rationalizations of slavery and human hierarchy. From Western Europe and the new settlements in Latin America, some Puritans carried across their judgment of the many African peoples as one inferior people. They carried across racist ideas that preceded American slavery, because the need to justify African slavery preceded colonial America. Again, it is a global world. So please don't tell me there was slavery and then, or there was like the KKK and then there was slavery. There was racism and then there was slavery. No, we are in a continued chain. A continued chain that, of course, is not about whiteness only. Like the Barbary pirates, Barabra, negotiating with John Adams and with Thomas Jefferson. They were doing what? They were pirates that were going around the coast of Europe and stealing Europeans, making them slaves, bringing them back to whatever empire of the day existed in order to work as slaves. Okay, somebody's going to tell me, no, it's a different kind of slavery. It's blah, blah, blah. Fine. But it's slavery. That Steve Marley song, Made in Africa. Educate yourself of Africa. Okay, we're about to do that right now. It's like, ships that sail to distant places robbed us of our rights and words. History says that you've betrayed us. Talking of the gods you serve, hear the rumbling in the sky. Tears our forefathers cry. And today we're still in chains. Take the shackles from our minds. You're the cornerstone, the king above the throne. Yeah, man. How beautiful art thou, Africa. Well, you know, on page 19 of Ibram Kendi's text, he says, quote, after Arab Muslims conquered parts of North Africa, Portugal, and Spain during the 7th century, Christians and Muslims battled for centuries over the prize of Mediterranean supremacy. Boy, what a waste of time that was. Meanwhile, below the Sahara Desert, this is where Africa comes in. This is what he's talking about. The West African empires of Ghana, 700 to 1200, Mali, 1200 to 1500, and Songhai, 1350 to 1600, were situated at the crossroads of the lucrative trade routes for gold and salt. A robust trans-Saharan trade emerged, allowing Europeans to obtain West African goods through Muslim intermediaries. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai developed empires that could rival in size, power, scholarship, wealth, any in the world. Intellectuals at universities in Timbuktu and Jenne pumped out scholarship and pumped in students from around West Africa. Songhai, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, grew to be the largest. Mali may have been the most illustrious. The world's greatest globetrotter of the 14th century, who trotted from North Africa to Eastern Europe and Eastern Asia, decided to see Mali for himself in 1352. Quote, there is complete security in their country, Ibn Battuta marveled in his travel notes. Quote, neither traveler nor inhabitant in it has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence. Ibn Battuta was an oddity, an abhorred oddity among the Islamic intelligentsia in Fez. Hardly any scholars had traveled far from home, and Battuta's travel accounts threatened their own armchair credibility in depicting foreigners. Boy, does that sound familiar. Continuing, none of Battuta's antagonists was more influential than the intellectual tower of the Muslim world at the time. Yes, my friends, Ibn Khaldun, who arrived in Fez just as Battuta returned from Mali. Ibn Khaldun now starts throwing shade, whispering that people in power don't totally believe what Ibn Battuta is saying about his trips. And just in case you thought I was absolving my people of this whole ugly human disaster, Ibn Khaldun reported in 1377 in the Muqaddimah, quote, the Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, unquote, Khaldun surmised. Quote, because Negroes have little that is essentially human and possess attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, unquote. And, quote, the same applies to the Slavs, unquote, argued this disciple of Aristotle. Following Greek and Roman justifiers, Khaldun used climate theory to justify Islamic enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans and Eastern European Slavs, groups sharing only one obvious characteristic: their remoteness. Like, see, now we call them the other. Their remoteness. Quote, all their conditions are remote from those of human beings and close to those of wild animals, Khaldun suggested. Okay, now I'm back reading from Ibram, not Ibn Khaldun. Their inferior conditions were neither permanent nor hereditary, however. Negroes who migrated to the cooler north were, quote, found to produce descendants whose color gradually turns white, unquote, Khaldun stressed. Dark-skinned people had the capacity for physical assimilation in a colder climate. Later, cultural assimilationists would imagine that culturally inferior African people placed in the proper European cultural environment could or should adopt European culture. You see how far back that goes? Ooh. It goes back so far. Try to act white. Ibn Khaldun did not intend to demean African people as inferior. He intended to belittle all different-looking African and Slavic peoples whom the Muslims were trading as slaves. You see that, Ibram Kendi? It's that justification of actions that have benefit. Back to the book. Even so, page 21, he reinforced the conceptual foundation for racist ideas. On the eve of the 15th century, Ibn Khaldun helped bolster the foundation for assimilationist ideas, for racist notions of the environment producing African inferiority. All an enslaver had to do was to stop justifying Slavic slavery and inferiority using climate theory, and focus the theory on African people for the racist attitude toward dark-skinned people to be complete. Okay, you're still with me. I know you're still with me. What are we doing? We're just threading. We're threading together to make an argument. Okay, so let's go to Ibram Kendi 137 in a chapter entitled Big Bottoms. And a reminder of a point that we made earlier, but in a new context. Check this out. Ending the international slave trade was in reality a boon for the largest American slave owners as it increased the demand and value of their captives. Okay, we covered that. Back to the book. And so the largest slave owners and the gradual emancipation advocates joined hands in cheering on the legal termination of the international slave trade on January 1st, 1808. Massachusetts clergyman Jedediah Morse deemed it a victory. He spoke for most northern assimilationist evangelicals when he proclaimed that since Christianity was finally lighting up the, quote, heathenish and Mohammedan darkness, unquote, of Africa, quote, its natives have no need to be carried to foreign lands, unquote. Morse believed that slavery would be gradually abolished too. Why? Because you don't need to enslave a Christian. So let me take you back to Lexington, Virginia in the post 9/11 era. And I'm living in a basement apartment after having moved to a number of different apartments and a dorm room in what was basically an underground railroad post 9/11 in Lexington, Virginia for me, among my friends and the university. And in the years that followed, after things kind of calmed down, I developed the habit of taking rides in that beautiful Toyota Corolla that my mom and dad sent me. And I would just drive. Little towns. There's a town called Buena Vista, but it's spelled Buena Vista, and I was playing Buena Vista Social Club in the car when I was going through that town, and okay, that's true, but it's also a joke. Good. So I go through these towns, and I look for antique stores. And, you know, in those days you're broke. Student loan money. But the antique stores always had a corner for books. And, you know, the books weren't expensive. We're talking about like $1. Take 10 for 5. Stuff like that. So I go into one of these antique stores, and I find a book by a man named Mason Crum. And it is entitled The Negro in the Methodist Church. The copyright is 1951 by the editorial department of the Board of Missions and Church Extension of the Methodist Church. And on the bottom, it says printed in the United States of America. Let me just read the first sentence of the preface. This is the first of a 2-volume popular study of the general theme of the Negro in the Methodist Church. Okay. Let's jump to page 29. I'm quoting now from Mason Crum. There is little doubt that the desire to evangelize the slaves was prompted not only by the normal enthusiasm of the Christian church to uplift a lowly people, but by a deep, though unexpressed sense that there was something inherently wrong about slavery. The enthusiasm then for slave conversion was at least a form of compensation for a felt wrong. Many good men and women found themselves hopelessly involved in a situation from which they could not extricate themselves. Christianization of the slaves became in part a form of release. Then there were callous and conscienceless slaveholders whose only regard was for profit. They realized the value of religion as a factor in keeping the Negro docile. At this period, Southern churchmen issued numerous tracts and sermons defending slavery and upholding it by scriptural authority. Both of these groups were quite willing to convert the slaves. There were many who not only believed the evangelization of the slaves was a solemn duty, but who also proved the genuineness of their profession by living their lives among them, amid the dangers and hazards of a malarial region in the summer, and the uninspiring association of hordes of underprivileged human beings who were not even permitted to read and write. All right. So you get the sense. That's a book that I randomly picked up in Southern Virginia. The Negro in the Methodist Church. And the idea that, even if you were against slavery and you couldn't make it go away, maybe you could at least explore the faith with the slave. Well, let me tell you how that works. So let's take the story of Omar ibn Said, born 1770. I'm looking at the American Historical Association 1925 publication from the American Historical Review number 30, 787 to 795. So I am now reading from the summary. Omar ibn Said was born around 1770 in an African region called Futatoro, near the Senegal River, which now forms Senegal's northern border with Mauritania. After receiving 25 years of schooling in Africa, he was enslaved and transported to Charleston, South Carolina. Not long after his arrival and sale to a local painter, Said escaped and made his way to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he was imprisoned after entering a Christian church to pray. After garnering attention for writing on the walls of his prison cell in Arabic, Said became the legal property of General Jim Owen of Bladen County. So who's Owen? Jim Owen was an American politician from North Carolina. This is from his Wikipedia page. A planter, major general, businessman, and enslaver of Omar ibn Said. He was educated in private schools in Pittsburgh. For many years, he was the president of the Wilmington and Raleigh Railroad and a major general of the militia. His brother was the governor of North Carolina. Owen was a member of the North Carolina State Legislature from 1808 to 1811. And then he became a member of Congress from North Carolina's 5th District, 1817 to 1819. Okay, so that is the person who owned Omar ibn Said after Omar ibn Said escaped. Okay, Omar ibn Said, so it's 1831, he publishes a manuscript entitled The Life of Omar ibn Said, and it's in Arabic. And in it, he describes his capture by, quote, a large army who killed many men, unquote, and his crossing of the, quote, Great Sea, unquote, for a month and a half. Said's account of so-called Christians who bind, transport, sell, and buy him links Said to other slave narrators who question the validity of the Christians' participation in and justifications for slavery. In fact, he sets true Christianity in opposition to slavery by describing his first master in Charleston, South Carolina, as a small, weak, and wicked man called Johnson, a complete infidel who had no fear of God at all. And to this question of conversion, let me come back to that article in the American Historical Review, July 1925. And let me simply read the following. Quote, "Two surviving artifacts of Said's Arabic writing provide insight into the complicated interplay between Christianity and Islam in his life. The first is a transcription of the 23rd Psalm, which Said had recorded in Arabic, and which was later translated back into English by Professor Wilson of the Princeton Theological Seminary. The translation reveals that Said prefaced the psalm with the invocation, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. In the name of God, the Merciful and Gracious, may God have mercy on the Prophet Muhammad. The second artifact is a card bearing Said's Arabic script. Inscribed on the back is the following explanation in English, quote, "The Lord's Prayer, written in Arabic by Uncle Moro, open brackets, Omar, a native African, now owned by General Owen of Wilmington, North Carolina. He is 88 years of age and a devoted Christian," unquote. The Arabic text, however, that is in the handwriting of Omar ibn Said is in fact not the Lord's Prayer. Rather, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. صدق الله العظيم. It's Surah Al-Mulk. The whole surah. All 30 verses. In his own handwriting. Including verse 29. قل هو الرحمن آمنا به وعليه توكلنا فستعلمون من هو في ضلال مبين. Say, he is the most merciful. We have believed in him, and upon him we have relied, and you will come to know who it is that is in clear error. It's Surah Al-Mulk. That's what Omar ibn Said left in his artifacts. 14 writings, all in Arabic, and a declaration of faith by a survivor of the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade, within which 20% of those captured from Africa died on the voyage to the New World. And they came to build a society. And so the question arises, what is a black star? Is warfare.
حضرات السادة الركاب، أهنئكم بسلامة الوصول إلى مطار القاهرة